Thank you, Ed. It's good to be here. I should warn you that when I agreed to come here some time ago, we were talking earlier in 2016, and the title was not yet Evangelicalism and Politics in the Trump Era, because I didn't know we were going to be in the Trump era, but we are, and we'll talk about it. All right. You don't have to be well-versed in the intricate details of etiquette to know some basic rules. The unspoken rules of polite conversation. Everyone knows at dinner parties you're not supposed to talk about politics or religion. In today's talk, and indeed in our entire symposium, we are breaking this rule and addressing them together. So why might etiquette books tell us not to talk about these subjects in polite conversation? I think the answer is pretty straightforward. People have strong, very deeply held beliefs about politics and about religion, and we can quickly reach impasses in discussion of both topics, and the subject matter of both topics can get very personal. Religious identity, it cuts to the heart of who we are and the way we view the world. It gives us a foundation for morality. It offers answers to existential questions about the meaning of lives. It helps shape our views of how we are to interact with others and with the divine. Religious worldviews often make truth claims, and these truth claims are sort of by definition exclusionary. Then we have politics. Politics can also reflect deeply held beliefs about the world and our place in it. Political ideology shapes our understanding of the role and functions of both government and the private sector. Our ideology helps us determine what issues are of greatest priority and what government should or should not do about them. Discussions of both of these subjects, religion and politics, tap into our values and beliefs about how we understand and approach the social and political world and our place in it. These discussions can very easily become deeply personal and polarizing if we hold contradictory views on notions of ultimate truth and competing perspectives on which values we think are most important. So, as a scholar of American politics who teaches at an evangelical institution, I really have no choice but to think about the intersection of religious and political worldviews in my everyday work. I won't claim that tackling these subjects is always comfortable or easy, but I can tell you with great confidence that such conversations are not only valuable, I believe they are essential. But don't just take my word for it. One of the most famous outside observers of American politics, Alexis de Tocqueville, famously remarked, "On my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention." Or consider the words of Mahatma Gandhi. "Those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is." To understand the basic contours of American politics, one needs to understand American religion and the way that religious values and beliefs inform political behavior. And I believe to understand American religion, we need to understand the evangelical movement and its place in American society. So my task today is to try to bring these two topics together and offer some reflections on evangelicals and politics in the Trump era. In the short time we have together this evening, I obviously will only scratch the surface, but I want to discuss the contemporary evangelical movement in the United States and its place in American politics. To do so, I first will attempt to define evangelicalism and then explain why such definitions are so complicated. Second, I'll highlight some of the current disagreements and debates related to evangelicals and politics. And as we'll see, I want to focus really on differences in debates within evangelicalism. And then finally, I'll offer a few thoughts about the usefulness of the term evangelical going forward. So let's begin. How do we define this term evangelical? Daniel Burke, who is the religion editor for CNN, began a story last spring with this opener. "It's an axiom in American politics duly repeated every 4 years. Evangelicals are the country's biggest and most powerful religious voting bloc, especially during the Republican primaries." Every election cycle, journalists and pundits talk at length about the evangelical vote. They offer bold predictions about how this group will vote, and they try to describe their influence in elections. Ironically, many of those who speak so freely about the evangelical vote probably wouldn't know an evangelical if they saw one. The term evangelical is quite common in everyday discussion, but its definition is disputed, even, or perhaps I should say especially, within its own ranks. In particular, discussions of the role of evangelicals in politics inevitably encounter two problems. How do we define the term evangelical, and how do we identify which people and organizations actually fit within this label? The definition of the term evangelical has shifted over the course of American history. In the 19th century, the term applied to groups that emphasized spiritual conversion and basically presumed conservative theology. Most 19th century Protestant denominations were pretty much part of this evangelical movement. By the early 20th century, however, theological differences had begun to divide Protestantism into two major camps, fundamentalists and modernists. We started with political controversies over how to best confront the social and economic problems of the growing nation, and this emerged from a theological debate. Proponents of liberal theology, or modernist, held a more optimistic view of human nature. They believed that the kingdom of God would be revealed through the improvement of society, and they embraced modern scientific thinking. Fundamentalism arose as a reaction against liberal theology and the growing secularism of the culture. Believing that the sinful nature of humankind makes it difficult or impossible to achieve the kingdom of God in history, fundamentalists focused on individual salvation and called for a return to the fundamentals of the faith. As a result, fundamentalist leaders advocated separating from the dominant culture. Over time, another group of Christian leaders started a movement that was trying to chart a path between the modernists and the fundamentalists. This new movement was originally called Neo-Evangelicalism. In 1947, a national conference of leaders gathered in St. Louis and founded the National Association of Evangelicals, an organization created to combine traditional theological principles with a renewed concern for social engagement. By later in the 20th century, Christian believers who shared these convictions became known as simply evangelicals. We dropped the neo part. From their beginnings, fundamentalism and evangelicalism were both diverse social movements, and they easily defied description. But these two movements are either commonly confused with one another, or sometimes they're just conflated as if they're the same. The contemporary evangelical movement, my focus this evening, is a fluid and diverse coalition that developed over time and continues to change in composition and character. Some people and organizations self-identify as evangelical. Others are given the label even if they don't use it for themselves. So, how in the world do we define a fluid movement like evangelicalism? Is this even possible? And if it's a movement, is it a social movement, a theological movement, a political movement? In contemporary discourse, it really seems like it's all of these and more. It really depends on who you ask and in what context you're discussing evangelicalism, what answer you will receive. In popular discussion, the term evangelicals is referenced in so many different ways that I think it sometimes risks becoming meaningless. In many ways, it reminds me of a chameleon. The definition is in the eye of the beholder. Current popular usage of the term is very fluid and means different things in different contexts. In a lot of journalistic accounts, evangelical is a synonym for white, politically conservative Christian. In common parlance, evangelical can also become a code word for a closed-minded religious fanatic. In my view, evangelicalism is best understood as primarily a theological and religious movement, but one that recognizably has critical social, cultural, and political implications. Ultimately, what distinguishes evangelicals should be their theological beliefs, their religious practice, and their care for a broken world. Of course, these beliefs and practices have significant implications for politics, but politics should be secondary to the theology. So, if evangelicalism is a religious movement, what are the beliefs and practices at the heart of it? The good news in the midst of all this confusion is there's a widely, if not universally, accepted definition. Historians David Bebbington and Mark Knoll describe evangelical as characterized by 4 parts. First, conversionism. Here there's an idea of the need for individual transformation, the idea that one must make a personal decision to accept Jesus Christ. Second, an emphasis on biblicism, seeing the Bible as the ultimate authority. Third, crucicentrism. An emphasis here is on the salvific work of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, hence the emphasis of the cross. And then fourth, the fourth prong of the definition is activism, the idea that one should live out the gospel in both missionary and also social reform efforts. So as you can see, this definition has beliefs very much at the center, but it also has a behavioral component. Now, I think the Bebbington-Knoll definition gives us a good set of parameters for defining evangelicalism, but this is a fluid movement and it's not going to create strict boundaries. Unlike religious denominations or sects that are somewhat easier to define with clearer lines of who's in and who's out, evangelicalism is in large part in the eye of the beholder. We don't really have any card-carrying evangelicals, nor does anyone have a monopoly on creating such membership cards. The closest approximations will have to be evangelical denominations or evangelical institutions with statements of faith, but even these lines can and do blur. So if we have sort of a definition, but we have a little bit of blurring, how in the world do we religion and politics scholars try to figure out how we can understand evangelicals? The definitions, albeit problematic, are the first step, but more complicated is the term we like to use is operationalize the definition. We have to turn this in to some way for researchers to identify who's an evangelical and who's not. If we want to understand the political behavior of evangelicals and other religious groups, the best thing we can do is survey them, ask them questions, and figure it out from there. Now, social scientists have some common measures that they use to try to capture religious behavior. We often talk about these things as the 3 B's: belief, belonging, and behavior. If we want to understand someone's religious commitment and the depth of it, these are the 3 things we can look at. Belief. This is the measure of what people say they believe. National surveys will have batteries of questions that ask lots of things. Belief in God in general, belief in God as a person with whom you can have a relationship. Views on the Bible, is it the Word of God? Belief in life after death, heaven and hell, miracles, these kinds of things you'll see. In many ways, these measures presuppose Christianity, and as researchers have pointed out, they're less helpful when we try to apply them to other religious groups. But even so, this set of questions does allow us to give at least some sense of a person's religious beliefs, particularly if we're looking at categories of Christian believers. And we do find that the responses can usually cluster into meaningful patterns. So one thing we can look at is belief. Second, we can look at belonging. This is a measure of connection with religious organizations. In national surveys, we typically ask about membership in religious congregations, participation in congregations, and sometimes things like if parents send their children to religious schools. Each of these factors gives us some indication of how tightly or how loosely a person belongs to a religious community. Thirdly, we ask about religious behavior. This is a measure of what people really do. A fancier term we often use is religious salience. The most common measure of religious behavior is how frequently people attend religious services. We usually shortcut this as church attendance, but we ask, other than funerals and weddings, how often do you attend religious services? Other measures we can ask, how frequently do you pray outside of a religious service? How frequently do you read the Bible or a sacred text? How often do you pray with your children? How often do you read the Bible or a sacred text with your children? These are examples of behavior that we can try to quantify in some way. Now, researchers are going to vary in how they ultimately classify religious people, but most agree that it's optimal to, in the ideal world, you really want to try to capture at least all 3 of these B's. But it's not always an ideal world. So how do researchers figure this out? How do we put into operation beliefs, belonging, and behavior in surveys? How do we sort people into these religious categories? Well, for many years, the answer was really simple. Not much at all. Because most surveys in the United States asked one religion question. Are you Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or other? The answer to this simplistic question, frankly, didn't tell us very much. Now, due to the groundbreaking work of religion and politics scholars, we've seen major improvements in the last 30 years. They have been part of meetings to encourage refining old questions and, importantly, adding new questions, more targeted questions that allow us to probe more deeply. Now, most major national surveys ask multi-step questions about religious identity. They ask about things like religious attendance and usually also include some belief measures. So survey researchers who want to look at evangelicals have to figure out how to get the evangelicals out of that survey. Usually they use one of three methods: self-identification, religious affiliation, or religious beliefs. The simplest method is simply to say, are you an evangelical or born again? If you answer yes, you're checked as an evangelical. A second, and somewhat probably slightly more precise method is to ask Protestant respondents what denomination of church they attend, and then researchers can sort them into either mainline or evangelical categories based on their denominational affiliation. The third and least common method identifies evangelicals based on responses to a series of questions about their religious beliefs. The decisions that researchers make about how to define evangelical matter, and they skew the results in different directions. Yet, when we hear discussions about evangelicals and politics, what they think, how they vote, it's rarely clear what method has been used to classify them. Consider a couple of examples of how this works in practice and some of the types of problems it can create. First, some surveys just simply don't have the space to ask a lot of questions about religion as much as we would like them to. And one survey that falls into this category is the exit poll. Exit polls are surveys conducted on election day as voters leave the polling place, and they help media outlets predict the outcome of the election, and then they give researchers real-time data about how people voted. And in many ways, I think they can be very useful. The exit polls and the 26 presidential primaries were quite problematic. In at least some states, exit polls of Democratic voters did not include any religion questions. Republican exit polls typically asked only one religion question: are you an evangelical or born again? Why did the researchers decide that Democrats weren't religious and ask them no questions? Why did they only ask the evangelical question of Republicans? If they had room for just one religion question, why didn't they just ask the Republicans about their religious affiliation more broadly? I can't answer these questions, but I can raise them. Second example, the general election exit poll included 3 religion questions: religious affiliation, church attendance, and if you're an evangelical or born again. I expect that just about everybody in the room has heard the much-cited statistic from this exit poll. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. We hear it, we believe it, we make judgments based on it. But there are other statistics you probably haven't heard. How about this one? 20% of those self-identified evangelicals say they seldom or never attend religious services. Now, it doesn't seem to me that it would take much of a leap at all to assume that that 81% figure, of which 20% never go to church, is capturing some cultural evangelical for whom religion is not particularly important. So now that I have set your minds spinning with discussions of definitions and some of the complexities that we survey researchers deal with, hopefully you'll have some empathy for people like me who try to understand and explain the complexities of religion and politics. With some of these methodological considerations front of mind, I'd like to turn to the second part of my talk tonight. And I'd like to offer some thoughts about key questions and debates surrounding the current state of evangelicalism in American politics. And as you'll see, we're going to have a lot of religious and political disagreement. In recent years, growing divides have been testing the boundaries and even the definitions of evangelicalism. Donald Trump's candidacy and victory revealed major fault lines in evangelicalism at both the leadership and grassroots levels. Notice I said it revealed. I'm not saying it created, but it showed us fault lines and perhaps expanded them. So let's start looking at the elite level. Likely the most visible debates within evangelicalism are apparent at the elite level. Clearly, leaders of evangelical denominations and institutions, along with the healthy sprinkling of self-proclaimed spokespeople, differ in their views of leadership and power. There are lots of different ways I could categorize evangelical elites, but for the purpose of tonight, I'm going to focus on one common distinction that's particularly relevant to this question of religion and politics. So I'm going to talk about what we call the old guard and the new guard of evangelical leaders. Discussions of the old guard point to those connected with Christian right institutions and leaders who reached the apex of their influence in the 1990s. In the wake of the turmoil of the 1960s, the founders of the Christian right decided to get more directly engaged in politics. Over time, many of these people became key figures in Republican politics. Some of the old guard leaders, like Jerry Falwell Sr., have died. Others, like James Dobson, have turned their ministries over to others and have sought something close to retirement. But there are still evangelical leaders who remain, who've taken over leadership posts from this older generation, and they continue in the style of these Christian right old guard leaders. And they directly connect religion and conservative politics. Examples of some of these would be Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, Jerry Falwell Jr. of Liberty University, and Franklin Graham of Samaritan's Purse. Traditionally, this group was known for having what we call purist vision of religion and politics. They viewed political issues in very sharp moral terms of right and wrong, and typically focused most of their attention on cultural issues like abortion and LGBT rights. They were the champion of so-called family values, and for that reason they were quite vocal in their criticism of figures like Bill Clinton and his sexual misconduct. The new guard of evangelical leaders offers a stark contrast. Most of the prominent evangelical leaders in the 1990s, as I mentioned, were deeply involved in politics. But today, evangelical leaders are a more diverse group. Many see politics as important, but not their leading concern. They typically have a more pragmatic approach to politics, and they want to broaden the scope of political issues that relate to faith. Examples of some of these leaders would be people like Russell Moore, the head of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Albert Mohler, Mark Labberton, and other seminary leaders, and high-profile pastors like Tim Keller and Rick Warren. Now, many observers of religion and politics, myself included, have argued that the old guard leaders have pretty much lost most of their influence. The 2016 election demonstrated that these predictions were probably a little bit premature. Old guard-style leaders have a much smaller following now than in the heyday of the Christian right, but they are still able to capture significant attention from the media and from political candidates. In the 2016 election, the divides between these two camps of conservative evangelical leaders were quite pronounced. One area of sharp difference was their view of power, which was most manifest in their contrasting views of Donald Trump. Most of the evangelicals leaders who aligned with the old guard politics supported Trump. Jerry Falwell Jr. welcomed him to Liberty University and publicly endorsed him. James Dobson was interviewed to talk about his support in an editorial for Christianity Today. Evangelicals' support for Trump, at least at the elite level, rested on the fundamental argument, issue positions matter most. Character concerns must be secondary. Evangelicals need people in power to champion their political goals. Consider a few examples. Writer and lecturer Eric Metaxas argued that Christians should vote for Trump because he is, quote, the last best hope of keeping America from sliding into oblivion. When asked to respond to the hot mic videotape of candidate Trump making lewd remarks about women, Gary Bauer replied, quote, the comments are obviously disgusting and unfortunate, but we'll still support Trump and work hard for him. His policies are 100% better than Hillary Clinton's for this country. In contrast, New Guard evangelical elites, notably people like Al Mohler, Michael Gerson, and Russell Moore, argued against voting for Trump, citing major concerns about his character and his temperament. Their fundamental argument was to call Trump out for race-baiting, anti-immigrant rhetoric, misogynist statements, and questionable personal character. Even if he aligns with them on certain issues, they argued, his personal characteristics are just not in line with Christian values, and they harm the church's most important goal of reaching the nations for Christ. So an interesting twist, the evangelical leaders who criticized Trump and did not The evangelical leaders who criticized Trump did not in turn endorse his opponent, as we would expect. Instead, they made it clear that they were not going to support either candidate in the 2016 election. Consider a few examples. In a panel discussion last summer, Russell Moore, the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, said that he would be writing in a candidate in the presidential election. When he was then asked, how can you do that given your pro-life commitments, he replied, the life issue cannot flourish in a culture of misogyny and sexual degradation. The life issue cannot flourish when you have people calling for the torture and murder of innocent non-combatants. The life issue cannot flourish when you have people who have given up on the idea that character matters. If you lose an election, you can live to fight another day and move on. But if you lose an election while giving up your very soul, then you have really lost it all. So I think the stakes are pretty high. Peter Waner, who worked for both Presidents Bush and is now at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, spent most of 2017 explaining why he would not support Donald Trump. Criticizing the old guard evangelical leaders who were falling in line to support Donald Trump in the summer of 2016, Waner wrote, quote, this fulsome embrace of Mr. Trump is rather problematic since he embodies a worldview that is incompatible with Christianity. If you trace that worldview to its source, Christ would not be anywhere in the vicinity. Ironically, faced with the Donald Trump candidacy, the purists became pragmatists. They admitted Trump had character flaws that were concerning, but they argued that the political agenda and maintaining access to power were paramount. Conversely, the pragmatists became more purist in their approach. They conceded that politics matter, but contended that principles and character matter more. So coming out of the 2016 presidential election, we see that evangelical elites were sharply divided about the Trump candidacy. It's too early to tell what this rift means for the future of evangelical leadership, but it's clear that there are stark differences in vision, and these debates have been very public. So if the 2016 election revealed significant rifts between evangelical leaders, even between those who were seemingly aligned together on the ideological right, what does it show us about what's happening at the grassroots level with the actual voters? Let me start with some of the basic numbers and then deconstruct them a little bit. As you likely know, white evangelicals have been a solid Republican voting bloc for at least a generation. Consider some recent numbers. George Bush received 78% of the vote in 2004. John McCain received 74% in 2008. Mitt Romney, 78% in 2012. You'll hear a lot about these numbers, especially in the media, but they mask important differences and divides. First, it hides some measurement problems. As I mentioned earlier, these off-cited numbers come from exit polls, so they're based on these people who are checking a box saying that they're evangelical. This isn't a terrible way to get at the question, but it's hardly refined. These data make it clear that large numbers of self-identified evangelicals voted for Trump. But it doesn't really give us a sense of who these so-called evangelicals are, nor does it tell us if they're looking at that label primarily as a religious or a cultural identity. Second, the emphasis on the strong Republican side of the voting equation means that we often overlook the 16 to 24% of white evangelicals who voted for Democratic candidates in recent presidential elections. This is not a monolithic vote. Evangelicals espouse a wider range of political views than the popular media would lead you to believe. Evangelicals on the political left, much like those on the right, agree with the theological distinctions at the crux of that Bebbington-Knoll definition I mentioned earlier. They agree with things like the centrality of Jesus Christ, the authority of the Bible, but the right and left diverge significantly on how they translate these commitments into politics. We find that these differences are going to stem in part from the Bible passages and concepts that each side chooses to emphasize. Those on the right tend to focus on issues related to personal morality, such as abortion and gay marriage. Those on the left tend to prioritize social justice issues like poverty, war, and racism. Perhaps the best question to distinguish the evangelical right from left is this: who is best positioned to solve the problems of our day? Activists on the right are most likely to seek individual solutions to policy dilemmas, whereas those on the left are going to advocate for a stronger role of government. Not surprisingly, these differences of perspective also map pretty well to the Republican and Democratic parties. In recent years, debates over LGBT rights have further tested the boundaries of evangelical politics. Societal views on LGBT issues have changed rapidly, and the central political framing of the issue has changed from personal morality to civil rights. Many on the evangelical left have found common cause fighting for justice for the LGBT community, and some evangelicals are changing their public positions on homosexuality. Yet, many on the right, especially the older generations, continue to hold traditional views of marriage and sexuality. Complicating things further, some pathways for expanding LGBT rights threaten religious liberty protections. A third complexity in the story is the nature of the choices in the 2016 election. By all accounts, Donald Trump was not a traditional Republican candidate, and he doesn't represent family values well. But many voters found Hillary Clinton an unacceptable alternative, leaving them trapped. In a Pew Center survey last fall, respondents were asked an open-ended question, meaning no choices, you just tell us what you think. And if people were supporting Trump, they said, why are you supporting Trump? The number one choice among evangelicals? 35% of them said, he's not Clinton. Second place, 34% said they liked his issue positions. As Carlin Bowman from the American Enterprise Institute summarized, several surveys show evangelicals likely voted for Trump despite his comments and behavior. Many right-leaning evangelicals found themselves in a bind. Do you vote for a candidate who disagrees with you on almost every issue? Or do you vote for a morally flawed candidate whose stated positions line up more closely with your own? Likely the best example to demonstrate this complexity was election coverage in Christianity Today, which is the flagship evangelical magazine. Prior to 2016, CT had never endorsed a presidential candidate. Last year, however, they did something different, and they ran side by side 3 editorials, one expressing support for Trump, one expressing support for Clinton, and a third expressing support for voting for neither of them. So, given the complexities of defining an amorphous movement like evangelicalism, and given the significant and very public divisions between different camps of evangelicals, let me offer a few concluding thoughts about, well, I think anyways, a pressing question. To what extent should we even be talking about evangelicals and politics? Is this still a useful approach? In the wake of the Trump victory, social media went wild with people publicly eschewing the label evangelical. Even before the election, Tony Campolo, an important figure in the evangelical left for many decades, announced that he no longer wanted to be identified as an evangelical. He wrote, "Some of us who hold the beliefs of evangelicals have problems with using the label." And he said instead he would like to be called a red-letter Christian. Here the term is referring to many Bibles that print the words of Jesus Christ in red. If my Facebook feed is any kind of barometer, and I'm not sure if it is, but it does seem like many self-identified evangelicals were so embarrassed by the news reports that evangelicals were a strong Trump voting bloc that they renounced the label for themselves as a sign of protest of the election outcome. Despite the many post-election outcries, however, other evangelicals continue to defend the label as meaningful and needed in contemporary culture. Mark Laberton and Richard Mao, the current and past presidents of Fuller Theological Seminary, responded to the race away from the evangelical label with a public statement saying that Fuller would not denounce its evangelical identity. They raised concerns over the over-politicization of the term and reminded their audience of the importance of evangelicalism as a theological identity. I will quote them at some length. "Evangelicalism has value only if it names our commitment to seek and to demonstrate the heart and mind of God in Jesus Christ. This calls us into deeper faith and greater humility. It also leads us to repudiate and resist all forms of racism, misogyny, and all other attitudes and actions, overt and implied, that subvert the dignity of persons made in the image of God. The only evangelicalism worthy of its name must be one that both faithfully points to and mirrors Jesus Christ, the good news for the world, and seeks justice that reflects the character of God's kingdom. Although I understand why many people are concerned about the use and misuse of the term evangelical, I believe it is still a meaningful descriptor of an important theological movement. The term has become overly connected to a political movement, in part due to the actions of some evangelical elites. But I don't believe we have to accept the status quo as what it should be. So instead of accepting the status quo, let me suggest 3 things that evangelicals could do to help reframe the discussion of evangelicalism and politics. First, those within the movement need to reclaim the label evangelical as a meaningful descriptor of religious beliefs and theological commitments. I understand much of the outcry over the term evangelical, and I have some sympathy from those who say it's no longer useful. But if the term is getting misused or conflated with other ideas or movements, I may think it is best for those within the movement to reclaim the term and help reshape its popular image. I'm personally not ready to give up on a term that has real meaning and significant power. As an evangelical Christian, I believe we are called to evangelize, to tell others about the good news of Jesus Christ. It's one of my fundamental religious commitments, and it makes sense to use a term that's so deeply reflective of what I believe. So instead of retreating from the label, evangelicals should seek to educate and to inform, to take back the term as a meaningful descriptor of theologically conservative Christians whose faith informs their everyday lives. Second, evangelicals can also help reframe the discussion by moving away from party-based politics. I make this point for 2 central reasons, one practical and one more theological. Practically, it's unwise for any group to align too closely with a political party because they risk losing influence. We have a term for this in the American politics literature. We say when a group is so close to one party or the other that they can become taken for granted, we say that group has been captured. The theory goes like this. Parties build coalitions to win elections and to maintain power. To do so, they make alliances with various groups, and they build these groups and voting blocks together until they have enough different groups of supporters to make sure that they can succeed. Parties court the groups that they believe they need on their side, and then they promise to be responsive to their concerns. But if a group is so closely aligned with one party that their vote is all but guaranteed, elected officials find it less necessary to deliver on promises to maintain their support. They will court these voters just enough to keep them happy, but they won't face great pressure to respond to their concerns. After all, if a group is solidly in your camp, then those people probably think they have no political alternative. You don't have to work too hard to court those voters. In many ways, we saw this axiom play out in the 2016 election. Trump reached out to evangelical voters and promised to take care of them. He aligned himself with them on many issues and repeatedly spoke of how much he loved evangelicals. All the while, his lifestyle, religious practice, rhetoric, and character seemed antithetical to many core Christian teachings. As I've sought to outline this evening, many evangelicals were conflicted about their vote. One would think that the Democratic Party would have capitalized on this moment and reached out to religious voters who had serious doubts about Trump. Instead, they wrote off evangelicals as a solid Republican bloc and didn't devote efforts to reaching them. Ironically, despite her deep and abiding Christian commitment, Hillary Clinton all but ignored evangelical voters. Journalist Ruth Graham summarized, "She didn't hire a full-time faith outreach director until June and had no one specifically focused on evangelical outreach. She didn't give a major speech to the evangelical community and never met publicly with evangelical leaders. Religious publications reaching out to her campaign with questions were frequently met with silence." Michael Waner, an evangelical Democrat who directed religious outreach for Obama's 2012 campaign, was blunt in his criticism of the Clinton campaign. He said, quote, "Not to have anyone reaching out to a quarter of the electorate is political malpractice." Both parties acted as if the evangelical vote was captured by the Republican Party. Trump told evangelical voters he was the only candidate who cared about them, and Clinton's silence reinforced that message. As Michael Waner explained, through their lack of direct outreach and relative silence on their concerns, the campaign conveyed to evangelicals that they were right to fear political loss, that the election was in fact a zero-sum game for them. By ignoring these voters, the Clinton campaign affirmed Trump's message to them. Trump was the only candidate who cared, and he was the only one who could save them. It's no wonder that so many evangelical voters felt trapped in the 2016 election. They're a classic example of a captured voting bloc. Practically, if you want political influence, it's better to be seen as an important block of voters to both parties so that they vie for your vote. But this practical concern is only one reason that evangelicals might want to rethink their close connections to the Republican Party. Another reason, in my view, is much more important. Evangelicals should distance themselves from party politics for theological reasons. At its heart, evangelicalism is a theological movement. It reflects deep religious convictions. Following Christ is not about following a political party. The focus of our faith is the saving work of Christ and living for him. Christians owe allegiance to Christ and to Christ alone. Biblical principles matter. Jesus' teachings matter. Like people of any faith, evangelicals should seek to apply their faith to their lives and allow it to deeply shape the way that they advocate for the needs of those around them. I fully expect that evangelicals will be involved in politics, but political activity should be an outgrowth of theological convictions. Politics for the Christian is never merely a means to an end. Which brings me to my final suggestion for addressing these evangelical divides. Evangelicals need to engage in bridge building within our own ranks. I expect when we look back in history to this time period, we will note that the evangelical movement reached an important turning point in the wake of the 2016 election. Internal divisions are deeply rooted, and at times it looks like the chasm between the opposing sides is too deep to restore. Popular misunderstandings of the movement complicate matters further and likely add fuel to fires of division that have already been burning. My hope is that we can find ways to build bridges between the various camps of evangelicals and heal some of the divisions. The bonds that unite evangelicals are very strong. Indeed, I believe that that bond is supernatural, as our faith teaches that we have unity as brothers and sisters in Christ. The 2016 election exposed divisions and deepened some of the chasms that divide evangelicals, but it also opens a great opportunity to regroup and refocus our attention on the essentials of the faith. My hope is that when we look back on decades or more from now at evangelicals and politics in the Trump era, historians will see this time as a time when a fractured group came together, healed many of its divisions, and emerged as a stronger witness to their faith. Thank you.